Hi, I'm Megan. I'm 33 years old, and for most of my adult life, my own family had a name for me at the dinner table. Not my name, a word. The one who never made it. The one who works some paperwork job nobody understands. 3 months ago, at my brother's 36th birthday party in a restored old dance hall my grandfather used to own, David stood up in front of 40 people, raised his glass, looked straight at me and said, "A toast to the only failure in this family." Everyone laughed. Some of them looked at me first to see how I would react, like they already knew this was coming, like it was a running joke I had never been let in on. I smiled, I lifted my own glass an inch off the table, just enough that nobody could say I refused, and I did not put it down until the room stopped watching me. That was the moment. Not the loudest fight, not the worst holiday, just a toast, said out loud, in a room full of people who mattered to my family more than I did. I want to tell you the whole thing from the beginning, because none of it makes sense without the years that came before that glass got raised. If you are listening right now, from your car, from your kitchen, from a bed you cannot sleep in, I want you to know something before we go any further. You already know how this kind of story ends inside you, because you have lived some version of it. Have you ever sat in a room full of people who clearly loved somebody else more than they loved you, and had to smile anyway because making a scene would only prove them right about you? If that question landed somewhere real, stay with me for a minute. And if you want more stories like this one, true ones, told slow and told honest, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, the button is right under this video, and it is the only way I know to keep telling these stories to people who need to hear that the quiet ones win too, eventually in their own way. I need to back up further than that party though, because you will not understand what that toast cost me unless you understand what I had been doing for this family for almost 10 years before anyone ever raised a glass to anything I did. I am a real estate attorney. Not the kind you see on television, not courtroom drama, nothing like that. I work in title and foreclosure law in Fort Worth, Texas, at a small firm most people have never heard of, doing the kind of paperwork that keeps houses and buildings legally attached to the people who own them. Liens, deeds, notices of default, the recorded history, hiding underneath every property anyone has ever bought. My father used to describe my job to his friends as, "She does something with papers downtown," like he could not be bothered to learn the actual words. My mother called it a nice stable job, the way you would describe a job you were embarrassed to explain further. Here is the part nobody at that party knew, or maybe some of them knew and just never said out loud. 4 years earlier, when my parents fell behind on the mortgage on the house I grew up in, when a hospital bill from my father's knee surgery landed on top of 2 months of missed payments and a letter with the word delinquent stamped across the top, I was the one who paid it. Quietly, no conversation at dinner, no thank you card, nothing. I wired $11,400 to a mortgage servicer on a Tuesday afternoon during my lunch break, and I never told a single person in my family that I had done it. I told myself it did not matter who knew. I have told myself that so many times over the years that I almost believed it. That was not the only time. 2 years before that, when David's first business, a small events rental company he ran with a friend from college, folded under debt, neither of them could explain to a bank, I was the one who sat with him at my kitchen table until midnight, going through every line of every loan document, finding the clause that let him walk away from a personal guarantee that would have followed him for a decade. I did the same thing for my parents' credit cards the year before that, and for a car loan that had ballooned into something neither of them understood the year before that. Every single time, I was the invisible mechanism that kept this family's house of cards from collapsing in public. And every single time, the story that got told afterward left me out completely. At every family dinner, for as long as I can remember, David was the success story and I was the cautionary tale, even though the math never once supported that version of events. He talks fast, he shakes hands well, he has the kind of charm that makes a room decide to like him before he has said anything worth liking. I have always been the opposite, careful, quiet, the kind of person who reads the entire contract before signing the first page, which apparently in my family translates directly into boring. My father would ask David about his latest deal for 20 minutes straight, leaning forward, laughing at things that were not funny, and then turn to me and ask if I was still doing the paperwork thing, before turning back to David before I had even finished my sentence. Sunday dinners at my parents' house followed the same pattern for years. The same table, the same seating, David and Brittany at one end near my father, me somewhere along the side near whoever wanted to talk about the weather instead of anything real. My mother always set out her good plates, the ones with the thin gold rim she only used for company, even though it was just us, because some part of her still treated every Sunday like an audition for a family that looked good together in photographs. I would sit through 2 hours of David talking about vendor contracts and event bookings, nodding at the right moments, and then drive home alone to an apartment nobody in my family had ever actually visited, wondering every single week at what exact point competence had stopped being enough to earn a place at the center of that table. I used to think that if I just kept being useful, kept fixing what needed fixing, kept quietly making sure nothing in this family actually fell apart, someone would eventually notice and say it out loud. I do not think that anymore. I think some families build an entire identity around one person being the star and another person being the background. And once that story gets told enough times at enough dinners, changing it feels, to everyone else, like betrayal. I was the background. I had been the background for 10 years. I had gotten so good at being the background that I almost forgot I was allowed to want something else. Almost. What none of them knew, what none of them had ever bothered to ask about in 10 years of calling my job boring, is that title and foreclosure law is exactly the kind of work where you end up knowing things. Public records are public for a reason. Liens get recorded, notices of default get filed with the county clerk, and anyone with the right login can search them by address in under a minute. I did not go looking for anything about my brother's business that spring. I want to be clear about that from the start. I found it because finding things like that is literally my job, and one ordinary Tuesday morning, an address I recognized without even trying, scrolled across my screen, and I sat completely still in my office chair for almost a full minute before I let myself read it twice. The address belonged to a building called the Aldridge Room, a restored 1920s dance hall on the edge of downtown Fort Worth that our grandfather Walter had bought decades earlier and turned into a supper club, back when that kind of place still drew crowds on a Friday night. When Walter passed, the building went to my father, who let it sit mostly empty for years, paying property taxes on a beautiful old shell nobody used, until David decided 6 years ago that he wanted to bring it back to life as an event and supper venue. Everyone in the family treated this as the moment David finally became something. Dinners for 120 guests, a bar built from reclaimed oak, photographs of David in a tailored jacket standing under the restored chandelier, shared and reshared at every family gathering like proof of something. I want to be honest that the Aldridge Room was never just David's building to me either, even before any of this happened. I have my own memories of that place from before it was restored. Back when it still smelled like dust and old varnish, and Grandfather Walter would let me sit behind the abandoned bar while the adults talked, handing me a rag and letting me pretend I was polishing glasses for customers who never came anymore. When David gutted it and rebuilt it into something magazine-worthy, some part of me grieved a version of that building that only I seemed to remember, the quiet, unglamorous one, the one that felt like it belonged to anybody who loved it rather than to whoever could make it profitable. Nobody ever asked whether I wanted a say in what happened to it. It had simply been assumed, the way everything financial in this family was assumed, that David would be the one to decide, and I would be the one who occasionally paid for the decision. For 6 years, every family dinner turned, at some point, into an update on the Aldridge Room. How many events booked this quarter? Which local magazine had written about it? Which minor celebrity had rented it out for a birthday? My father would ask these questions with a kind of hunger in his voice I never once heard him use, when he asked about my cases, my clients, or the fact that I had passed the bar exam on my first attempt while working 2 jobs to pay for the study materials. When I did bring up something from my own work, at best I got a polite nod before the conversation returned to David. At worst, my mother would say something like, "We are so glad one of you found something you are good at," in a tone that made it very clear which one of us she meant. I want to pause here for a second because I know some of you listening have your own version of this, your own sibling or parent who gets the warm voice while you get the polite nod. If that is you, and this story is landing somewhere real, would you do something small for me? Hit that subscribe button. It is completely free. It sits right under this video, and it is honestly the only thing that lets me keep finding and telling stories like this one for people who needed to hear them. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight, because I read every single one, and knowing this reaches someone in a kitchen or a car somewhere makes the rest of what I'm about to tell you feel like it was worth going through. There was one dinner, about 2 years ago, that I still think about more than I would like to admit. My mother had made a big production of a pot roast, the kind of dinner that meant company was coming, and halfway through the meal my father raised his fork toward David and said, "This one right here is going to take care of all of us one day. You watch." Nobody said anything after that. Nobody needed to. I sat there with a piece of carrot balanced on my fork, and I remember thinking very clearly, he already has been for years, and none of you have noticed. And if I said that sentence out loud right now, it would sound like jealousy instead of the truth. So I put the carrot in my mouth and asked my mother if she wanted help clearing the table. The request for help never stopped being disguised as something else. It was never, "Megan, can you cover this?" It was, "David is going through a rough patch with the venue, and your father and I do not want to bother him about it. Could you just check in with the bank? You understand these things better than we do." I understood exactly what that meant. I had understood it every time for 10 years. So I would make a call, review a document, sometimes quietly transfer money into an account and call it a loan I both knew would never be repaid. And afterward, the story that circulated at the next family gathering was some version of, "David is handling everything so well considering," and I would nod along because contradicting it would have required explaining things nobody in my family had ever wanted explained. I can still recite the exact numbers from some of those quiet rescues. The way you remember details from moments that mattered more than anyone around you realized. $6,200 on my mother's credit card the year the roof needed replacing, and nobody wanted to ask David because he was, in my father's words, already stretched thin with the venue. Another $4,000 when my father's truck needed a transmission rebuild, and unemployment from a temporary layoff had eaten through their savings faster than anyone expected. Small amounts individually, the kind of numbers that do not sound dramatic when you say them out loud, but they added up, year after year, into a quiet, private ledger only I ever kept. A ledger nobody else in my family even knew existed, let alone ever thought to balance in my favor. I think the pattern started earlier than any of the money, actually. I remember being maybe 12 years old, finding my mother crying at the kitchen table over a bill she did not know how to read, and instead of getting upset or making it worse, I sat down next to her and read it out loud, slowly until she understood it. She hugged me and told me I was such a good, steady girl, and even at 12, something in me filed that sentence away as the highest compliment I would ever receive from her. Good and steady. Not brilliant, not remarkable, just reliable, the kind of praise you give furniture that has never once let you down. I spent the next 20 years trying to earn a bigger compliment than that, and it never came, because good and steady once assigned apparently does not get upgraded. So there I was, that ordinary Tuesday morning, staring at a recorded document search that had nothing to do with my brother, running a routine check for an entirely unrelated client, when the Aldridge Room's address appeared in a result I had not expected, a notice of default filed by the county clerk 3 weeks earlier against a deed of trust recorded on the building 2 years before. The lender's name meant nothing to me at first, Sutter Capital Partners, but the loan amount stopped my breathing for a second. $650,000, a hard money loan, the kind of financing you take when a regular bank has already said no, at an interest rate that told me exactly how desperate whoever signed it had been. I did what I would have done for any client, because that is the training. You do not react, you verify. I pulled the full recorded history of the property. I found the original deed of trust signed by David 2 years earlier, using the Aldridge Room itself as collateral for the loan that paid for the renovation everyone in my family had spent 2 years bragging about. I found the missed payment schedule. 4 months behind, then 5. I found the balloon payment structure, due in full within the year, a number large enough that I read it 3 times to make sure I was not misunderstanding the document. My brother had built the family's proudest achievement on top of a debt that was already collapsing, and not one person at that pot roast dinner had any idea. I remember exactly what the office looked like in that moment because I have replayed it enough times since. Late morning light coming through the blinds in stripes across my desk, a half-finished cup of coffee going cold beside my keyboard, the soft hum of the copier down the hall that never quite stopped running. I read the recorded balloon payment amount a 3rd time, and then I did something I am not proud of. I closed the browser tab entirely, stood up, walked to the small kitchen down the hall, and poured myself water I did not actually want, just to have something ordinary to do with my hands while my mind caught up with what I had just found. 10 years of watching this family treat David's success as the only real success in the room, and the whole foundation of it had been quietly rotting for months without a single one of them noticing. I did not tell anyone that day. I sat with it for almost a week, the way you sit with a diagnosis before you say it out loud to anyone else, turning it over, trying to decide what kind of person I wanted to be about it. Part of me wanted to call my father immediately and say, "Do you know what he actually built this on?" But I already knew exactly how that conversation would go, because I had had versions of it before. It would become, somehow, about my tone, about why I was digging into David's business, about whether I was trying to make myself look better by making him look worse. So instead, I picked up the phone and called the one person in my professional life who had never once needed convincing that I knew exactly what I was doing. His name is Robert Hale, and he has been practicing title and foreclosure law in Texas for almost 30 years. He hired me straight out of law school when nobody else would take a chance on someone who had worked her way through night classes, and he has been the closest thing I have had to a mentor since. I told him everything, the address, the loan amount, the family relationship, all of it, and he sat quietly on the other end of the phone for a long moment before he said the sentence that changed the direction of everything that came after. He said, "Private lenders in default situations do not want a long foreclosure fight. They usually want out fast, and sometimes, if you know what you are doing, you can buy the debt itself before it ever gets that far." Robert had taken a chance on me back when nobody else would, the year I graduated law school, with more student debt than most of my classmates because I had put myself through night classes for the first 2 years while working full-time as a paralegal during the day. He used to tell people I read title reports the way some attorneys read novels, slowly, carefully, looking for the sentence hiding underneath the sentence everyone else had already skimmed past. He never once asked me to explain why competence mattered so much to me, and in a strange way that made him the first person in my adult life who simply accepted that it did, without needing a family story to make sense of it first. I want to explain this simply because it changed everything. And it is not complicated once somebody breaks it down. When David borrowed that money, the lender, Sutter Capital, did not just hand over cash out of kindness. They recorded a deed of trust against the building itself, which means the loan is legally attached to the property, not just to David's promise to pay it back. If the loan stays in default long enough, the lender has the right to foreclose and take the building. But before that happens, especially with a private lender who does not want the cost and public mess of a long foreclosure, that same lender can simply sell the debt itself, the note and the deed of trust together, to somebody else for less than the full amount owed, just to get their money out fast and move on. Robert asked me one direct question. Did I want to be the person who bought that debt? I remember sitting in my car in the firm's parking lot for almost 20 minutes after he asked that, not because I did not know the answer, but because saying it out loud made it real in a way that thinking it privately had not. This was not about revenge, not in the way people usually mean that word. Nobody was going to get hurt who had not already built their own risk into that building with their own signature. If Sutter was already planning to collect on a defaulted debt no matter what, the only real question was whether that collection happened through a stranger who did not care about my family at all, or through me, someone who at least understood exactly what was at stake for everyone involved. I sat with that question for longer than 20 minutes, if I am honest, over the following 2 days, turning it over during a run one evening, during a load of laundry the next morning, testing it from every angle I could think of. Was I punishing David for being loved more, or was I simply refusing for the first time to let his mistakes become my invisible responsibility, the way everything else always had? I decided somewhere around the second morning that those were two different questions and that only one of them actually mattered. Nobody forces a person to sign a hard money loan against a building they only technically share ownership of through their father's goodwill. David had made that decision entirely on his own, the same confident way he made every decision, certain it would work out because it always had before. There was a real problem, though. Buying a defaulted note at a discount still requires real money, fast, before the lender changes their mind or the situation resolves itself some other way. I had savings more than most people would guess from someone who still drove a 9-year-old car, because I'd spent a decade being careful with money out of habit more than ambition. I also had something nobody in my family knew about, an account my grandfather Walter had quietly set up in my name before he passed, separate from the building he left to my father, with a note attached that said, "For the one who always does the reading, nobody else wants to do." I had never touched it. I had never even told my parents it existed. Suddenly, for the first time, I understood exactly why he had given it to me instead of anyone else. My grandfather Walter used to say I was the only one of his grandchildren who ever asked him real questions about the business, how the numbers worked, why some months were slower than others, what he would do differently if he had it to do over again. David used to roll his eyes whenever I brought up the Aldridge Room's old ledgers at family gatherings, calling it boring the same way my father did. And Walter would just look at me across the table with something like quiet amusement, like he already suspected something the rest of the family had not figured out yet. When his lawyer read the will after he passed, the separate account with my name on it surprised even me, but looking back, I think Walter had been watching all of us far more carefully than any of us realized at the time. This is the part of the story where I stopped being someone things happened to and became someone who decided something, and I think that turn matters enough to pause on again. If you have ever sat quietly on the edge of a decision like that, knowing it would change how your whole family saw you, whether they ever found out the real reason or not, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. And if this story has you leaning forward the way it has me reliving it, please take half a second to subscribe. It is free, it lives right under this video, and every single subscriber tells me that these stories, the quiet ones, the ones about being underestimated for years, are worth continuing to tell. Robert helped me set up a small holding company, Prairie Note Holdings, so that my name would not appear anywhere near the transaction and tip anyone off before I was ready. Through that entity, we approached Sutter Capital with an offer to purchase the defaulted note directly at a discount, closing within 30 days. In cash, no financing contingency, no drawn-out due diligence. Sutter's people did not know or care who stood behind Prairie Note Holdings. They cared about one thing, getting out of a defaulted commercial loan without the cost and delay of a contested foreclosure. After 2 weeks of back and forth over price, we agreed on $380,000 for a note with an outstanding balance well over $600,000, a number that made sense for a lender who wanted certainty more than they wanted every last dollar. While all of that moved quietly through escrow, life at home kept going exactly the way it always had. My mother called to tell me David and Brittany were planning something big for his 36th birthday. Combined with the 1-year anniversary of the Aldridge Room's grand reopening, 40 guests, caterers, the whole thing at the venue itself, she asked almost as an afterthought if I was bringing anyone the way she always asked, like my presence at these things was a formality rather than an expectation. I told her I would be there. I did not tell her that by the time that party happened, the paperwork sitting quietly in an escrow file somewhere might already have my company's name on the deed to the building where it was being held. Robert warned me more than once to keep my expectations realistic. Buying the note did not automatically mean I would own the building. If David somehow found a way to bring the loan current, paid off the balloon, or refinanced elsewhere before any further default proceedings matured, Prairie Note Holdings would simply become his new lender, quietly collecting payments like any other note holder, and nothing dramatic would ever need to happen at all. I told Robert that was fine with me either way. I meant it mostly. But some smaller, more honest part of me had already started imagining the exact moment I would need David to keep missing those payments, and I was not proud of how much I hoped for it. About 3 weeks before the party, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off a birthday gift for David that my mother had asked me to help wrap. And while I stood in the hallway outside the kitchen, I heard my father on the phone with an old friend from his own days working construction. He was talking about the Aldridge room, of course. And at some point he said, "And you know Megan, she does her little paperwork thing. Never really amounted to much, but David built something real." I stood in that hallway holding a gift bag with a bow on it, and I did not walk in right away. I let myself hear the whole sentence all the way to the end because some part of me needed to hear it clearly one more time before everything changed. I want to be honest about what that did to me because it was not anger, not exactly. It was something closer to relief, the strange kind of relief you feel when a suspicion you have been carrying for years finally gets confirmed out loud, even if the confirmation hurts. For a long time I had told myself maybe I was exaggerating it. Maybe my father loved me the same amount and just showed it differently. Maybe I was the problem for needing more than he knew how to give. Standing in that hallway, I stopped telling myself that story. He did not love us the same amount. He loved what David represented, the version of success he understood, and he had no framework at all for understanding what I actually did every day, so he had simply decided it did not count. Meanwhile, the numbers kept moving exactly the way Robert had predicted they might. David never brought the loan current. I do not think he ever even realized the note holder had changed because Prairie Note Holdings sent the same routine notices any lender sends, and nobody in his position reads those closely when they assume nothing has changed. The balloon payment came due 6 weeks before the party and went unpaid. As the new holder of the note and the deed of trust, my company had the legal right to proceed with a trustee's sale, a formal, fully public foreclosure process published in the county legal notices for anyone to see, though almost nobody outside the industry ever actually reads them. Those 6 weeks between the balloon payment coming due and the trustee's sale felt longer than almost any stretch of time in my adult life. I went to work every day, drafted documents for other clients, sat through meetings about property lines and easements that had nothing to do with my own family, and came home every night to an apartment that felt too quiet for how loud my thoughts had become. I did not tell Chloe the full truth yet during those weeks, not because I did not trust her, but because saying it out loud, even to my closest friend, would have made it feel irreversible before I was ready for it to be irreversible. I kept the folder of documents locked in a drawer in my home office, and some nights I would take it out just to reread the recorded deed of trust one more time, checking, rechecking the way you check a stove burner 3 times before finally believing it is off. The trustee's sale happened on a Thursday morning, 8 days before David's party, on the courthouse steps in a corner of downtown maybe 6 people in the entire city knew existed. Nobody showed up to bid against Prairie Note Holdings because nobody else knew there was anything worth bidding on. A heavily encumbered commercial property with a complicated ownership history is not the kind of opportunity that attracts a crowd. My company bid the amount of the outstanding debt, was declared the successful bidder, and 8 days before my brother's 36th birthday, before the 1-year anniversary party for the venue he believed was still entirely his, the recorded trustee's deed transferring legal ownership of the Aldridge room to Prairie Note Holdings was filed with the county clerk. The trustee who ran the sale that Thursday morning was a tired-looking man in a gray suit holding a clipboard. Reading the legal description of the property out loud to an empty stretch of sidewalk in a voice that clearly expected no response, the way you read something you have read 100 times before to nobody in particular. I stood off to the side in a plain coat, not saying a word, watching Robert's associate formally submit our bid on behalf of Prairie Note Holdings. The whole process took under 4 minutes. No gavel, no dramatic pause, just a folder changing hands and a receipt printed on the spot. And then the trustee packed up his clipboard and walked back toward the courthouse like he had somewhere else to be, leaving me standing there holding a piece of paper that had just quietly rearranged my entire family's future. I drove to the courthouse parking lot afterward and sat in my car with a certified copy of that recorded deed in my hands, and I cried in a way I had not expected to. Not from sadness exactly, more from the sheer weight of what I was now holding. I was, as of that morning, the legal owner of the building my family had spent 6 years treating as proof that David had become something, and I had not. I had not told a single person, not my parents, not David, not even my closest friend Chloe, who kept texting to ask if I was coming to the party and whether I was doing okay, because I had been distant for weeks in a way she noticed even from a distance. I finally called Chloe back 2 nights before the party, and I told her the smallest true version of what was happening, that something big had shifted with David's business, that I could not explain the details yet, and that I was scared of what would happen at that party once I decided what to do with what I knew. Chloe has known me since we were 19 years old, and she did not ask a single follow-up question I was not ready to answer. She just said, "Whatever you decide to do in that room, you have spent 10 years being the one who cleans up everyone else's mess quietly. If this time you decide not to be quiet, I will be proud of you either way." I held on to that sentence for the next 2 days like it was the only solid thing in the room. The night before the party, I printed 3 copies of the recorded trustee's deed and the full chain of title behind it, and I placed them in a plain manila envelope that I set on my kitchen counter next to my car keys, the way you leave something out so you cannot talk yourself out of bringing it in the morning. I did not plan a speech. I have never been someone who performs well from a script, and I did not want whatever happened the next day to feel like a performance. I just wanted the truth to be somewhere in the room, on paper, in case the moment ever called for it. I went to bed around midnight and did not sleep more than 2 or 3 hours, which, looking back, felt exactly right for the last ordinary night of my old place in that family. The morning of the party, I arrived at the Aldridge room 40 minutes early, the way I arrive everywhere, and I sat in my car in the parking lot watching caterers carry trays of glassware through the same doors our grandfather Walter used to prop open with a brick decades earlier. David stood near the entrance in a navy blazer, shaking hands with vendors, laughing at something one of them said, completely certain in every visible way that this building belonged to him. I sat there with the manila envelope on the passenger seat beside me, and I thought about all the dinners, all the pot roasts, all the times I had quietly wired money and said nothing, and I finally understood that today was not going to be one more of those days, no matter how the next few hours unfolded. Inside, the Aldridge room looked exactly like every photograph David had ever posted of it, restored chandeliers throwing soft gold light across 40 round tables, a jazz trio playing quietly in the corner, glasses of champagne circulating on trays before anyone had even sat down. My parents arrived shortly after I did. My father, in a suit he only wears for occasions he considers important. My mother fussing over a gift bag twice the size of the one I had wrapped for her earlier. Brittany, David's wife, greeted me with a hug that lasted exactly as long as etiquette required, and not 1 second longer, then turned immediately to compliment my mother's dress. I found a seat near the back, close enough to see everything, far enough to disappear if I needed to. The envelope still sitting folded inside my bag under the table. Dinner moved along the way these dinners always did, plates of short rib and roasted vegetables, a toast from my father thanking everyone for coming, warm applause, the easy rhythm of a room full of people who liked each other, or at least liked being seen together. David's business partner, Stephen Cade, sat 2 tables over with his own wife, raising his glass more than once to toast the venue's success, calling it the best investment he had ever made, unaware, the way almost everyone in that room was unaware of exactly how precarious that investment had become in the weeks before that night. I watched David move between tables, glowing, thanking people for coming to celebrate a year of something he still, in that moment, fully believed was his. Then, near the end of dinner, David stood up with a fork tapping against his glass, and the room quieted the way rooms do when someone confident asks for attention. He thanked everyone for a year of the Aldridge Room, thanked our parents for believing in him, thanked Stephen for the investment, thanked Brittany for putting up with him. Then his eyes found me near the back of the room, and something in his expression shifted into the kind of smile people use right before they say something they think is funny and everyone else will find cruel. He raised his glass higher and said, "And let us not forget, every family needs balance, so here is a toast to the only real failure in this family, so the rest of us look even better by comparison." He laughed first. Most of the room followed a half-second later, that nervous, uncertain laugh people give when they are not sure if something was actually a joke. I felt my face go hot in the particular way it does when 40 people are deciding in real time whether to look at you or look away. I raised my own glass an inch the way I described at the very beginning of this story, just enough to not seem like I was making a scene, and I watched my father laugh loudest of anyone at that table, my mother giving a small, embarrassed smile that was somehow worse than if she had laughed too, because it told me she knew it was cruel and had decided to let it happen anyway. Under the table, my hand found the strap of my bag, and I felt the corner of that manila envelope through the fabric. And for the first time since I had printed those documents, I understood exactly why I had brought them, and exactly what I was about to do with them. I want to be clear about something, because it matters more than anything else in this story. I did not stand up because I wanted revenge in the loud, satisfying way people sometimes imagine it. I stood up because I was done being the quiet mechanism that absorbed everything so this family's story about itself could stay comfortable. I stood up slowly, the way you stand when you want a room to actually notice you are standing, and I asked if I could say something too, since David had been kind enough to offer a toast about our family. My voice came out steadier than I expected, steady in the exact way I had spent 10 years training it to be for courtrooms and closing tables, and the room, sensing something had shifted, went almost completely silent. I told them, briefly, what I actually do for a living, since apparently, after 10 years, it still needed explaining. I am a real estate attorney. I specialize in foreclosure and title law, which means, among other things, that I spend my days tracking exactly who legally owns exactly what, and what happens when the person who borrowed money against a property stops being able to pay it back. I said that slowly, watching David's easy smile hold for a second too long, the way a smile holds on someone who has not yet realized the ground has already shifted underneath him. I told the room that 6 weeks ago the loan behind this beautiful building went into default, and that 8 days ago the property changed hands entirely through an entirely legal, fully recorded process. I reached into my bag and set the manila envelope on the table in front of me, not opening it yet, just letting everyone see it was there. Then I raised my glass, the same glass I had barely lifted a minute earlier, and I looked directly at David and I said, "Since we are doing toast tonight, here is mine. To the only failure in this family, thank you for the joke." I needed the reminder of exactly how little any of you have noticed about what I actually do. And now, if you will let me finish it properly, here is the rest of my toast. To your new owner. I am the new owner of the Aldridge Room, as of 8 days ago, recorded with the county clerk, in the name of my company, and the deed is right here in this envelope if anyone would like to see it. The silence that followed did not feel like the silence after a joke nobody laughed at. It felt like the specific silence of 40 people simultaneously recalculating everything they thought they understood about the two people standing at that table. My father's face went through 3 distinct expressions in about 4 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, and then something closer to fear as he started doing the math himself. Stephen Cade set his glass down so fast it clinked hard against his plate. Brittany's hand found David's arm. My mother said my name once, very quietly, "Megan," the way you say a name when you are trying to make a sentence stop before it finishes. David just stood there, still holding his glass, his mouth slightly open, looking at me like he was trying to find the version of this moment where I was joking. David finally found his voice and said, "That is not possible. This building is mine." And I told him, calmly, that it had not been his for 8 days, not since Sutter Capital sold the defaulted note, entirely within their legal rights, to a company that had every right to buy it, a company I happened to own. I opened the envelope and set 3 copies of the recorded trustee's deed on the table, along with a letter from Robert Hale, the attorney who had guided the entire transaction and reviewed every document at every stage, confirming that the chain of title was complete, accurate, and entirely legal. Stephen Cade picked up one copy with visibly shaking hands and read the first paragraph twice before looking up at David with an expression that had already stopped being sympathetic. Here is the detail that mattered most to me in that entire moment, more than the shock on anyone's face. David had signed that original deed of trust himself 2 years earlier, without ever fully reading the clause that allowed the lender to sell the note to anyone they chose, at any time, for any price, without his permission or even his knowledge. He had built his entire identity and our family's entire story about him, on top of a document he had signed without understanding, the same way he had always moved through life, confident first, careful never. The instrument that ended that night for him was entirely his own signature, his own missed payments, his own decision not to read something carefully. I had not tricked anyone into anything. I had simply been paying attention, the one thing nobody in my family had ever valued in me. Nobody finished dinner after that. Service stood frozen near the kitchen doors, unsure whether to bring out the cake. My father tried twice to pull me aside privately to, in his words, sort this out like a family, and both times I told him, quietly but without softening it, that we could talk on Monday at my office like any other legal matter, because tonight was not the night for that conversation. David did not say another word to me for the rest of the party. He sat back down at the head table, staring at the recorded deed in front of him like it might rearrange itself into something else if he looked at it long enough. I finished my glass of wine, picked up the envelope, thanked the few guests who caught my eye on the way out, and walked out of a building I now legally owned into a parking lot that felt, for the first time in 10 years, entirely mine to stand in. That Monday, my father and David came to my office. The first time either of them had ever set foot in the place where I actually worked. I laid out the options as plainly as I would for any client. David could continue operating the Aldridge Room as a tenant under a new lease with my company, at fair market rent, with a real payment schedule and real consequences if it lapsed again, or the venue could be sold to a new operator entirely, with David walking away from it completely. I told them both calmly that I was not interested in punishing anyone further than the truth already had, but that I was also never again going to be the invisible safety net underneath decisions I had no say in and no credit for. My father, for the first time in my adult life, did not argue with me. David chose to stay on as a tenant, which surprised me less than it might surprise you, because the Aldridge Room is still underneath everything, the one thing he has ever built that people admire. He signed a lease with my company for 18 months at a rent calculated from an actual market appraisal, not from family sentiment, with automatic default provisions that trigger real consequences within 30 days of a missed payment, this time with no quiet rescue, waiting in the wings if he fails. I told him directly in that meeting that I would not be covering another missed payment silently ever again for him or for our parents, and that if the numbers did not work for him going forward, that would need to become his problem to solve, the way it always should have been in the first place. I know I keep stopping to say this, but I want to say it one more time here, near the end, because this is usually the part where people ask me the most questions. If a boundary like that feels impossible in your own life, if you have spent years being the reliable one who quietly holds everything together for people who never say thank you, I hope some part of this story gave you permission to imagine drawing your own line somewhere. If it did, please subscribe. It costs nothing. It is right underneath this video, and it genuinely helps me keep finding and sharing more stories exactly like this one. And tell me below, what would your version of that toast sound like if you ever got the chance to say it out loud? My mother called me 2 weeks after the party, crying, apologizing in the fragmented way people apologize when they are still partly trying to justify themselves at the same time. She said she never meant to make me feel like the failure, that David's toast was just a joke that went too far, that families say things they do not mean. I told her, gently but clearly, that 10 years of small comments add up to something more than one joke, and that I loved her, and that I was willing to keep having a relationship with her, but not the same one we had before, not one where I disappeared every time David needed the room. She did not fully understand what I meant that day. I think she understands it a little better now, 3 months later, though we have not talked about that night directly since. David called me once, about a month after the party, late on a Tuesday night, and for the first 10 minutes he mostly talked around the actual apology, explaining how stressed he had been about the loan, how he never meant for the joke at the party to land the way it did, how he had always assumed I understood he loved me even when he teased me. I let him talk until he ran out of explanations, and then I told him honestly that I did not need him to justify the joke. I needed him to understand why it had taken something this drastic for him to actually see me. He went quiet for a long moment, and then he said quietly that he did not know what to say to that, which was strangely the most honest thing he had said to me in years. We are still rebuilding something. I do not know yet what shape it will take. My father and I talk less now than we used to, which I think surprised him more than it surprised me. He has never apologized directly, not in so many words, but he has started asking me actual questions about my work. Real ones, what a title search involves, how foreclosure law actually functions. Questions he never once asked in 10 years before that party. I do not know if that is respect or simply curiosity born from finally needing something I understand better than he does. I have decided it does not matter which one it is. I answer his questions honestly, the same way I would for any client, and I no longer wait for him to notice me the way I used to wait because I have stopped needing that particular kind of noticing to know what I am worth. Financially, none of this changed my life the way people probably assume it did. Prairie Note Holdings collects a modest fair rent from the Aldridge Room lease, enough to cover the note payoff and some of Robert's fee, nothing close to the fantasy of overnight wealth this kind of story sometimes implies. That was never the point, and I want to be honest about that instead of dressing it up as something bigger than it was. What actually changed was smaller and somehow larger at the same time. I stopped being the family's invisible financial safety net. I stopped absorbing costs nobody acknowledged. I started being someone whose competence got mentioned out loud, sometimes reluctantly, but out loud, at dinners where for 10 years it had only ever been David's name spoken with any real pride. A few weeks after everything settled, Robert asked me to take the lead on a much larger case at the firm, a commercial foreclosure dispute involving a shopping center on the other side of the city, the kind of file he usually reserved for himself. He told me plainly that the way I had handled the Aldridge Room situation, calmly, thoroughly, without ever losing my composure even when the stakes became deeply personal, told him everything he needed to know about whether I was ready for bigger responsibility. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. It was a small moment, a single conversation in a hallway between 2 meetings, but it was the first time in years that recognition had come to me attached to nothing except the actual quality of my work. And I noticed walking back to my office afterward that it felt different than every other form of praise I had spent a decade chasing. I still think, more often than I expected to, about the exact second I set that envelope down on the table in front of David. Not because I enjoyed his face in that moment, though I will admit quietly that some small human part of me did. I think about it because it was the first time in 10 years that the truth about who had actually been holding this family together got said out loud in front of people who mattered, in a way nobody could quietly explain away afterward at the next dinner. That is what I actually wanted, more than the building, more than the money, more than watching David's face change. I wanted the story my family told about itself to finally include an accurate sentence about me. These days, I still go to family dinners. I still see David, still see my parents, still show up when it matters, but I show up differently now, without the quiet resentment I used to carry into every single one of those rooms for a decade. I do not need anyone to raise a glass to me to know what I am capable of anymore. I proved that to myself the day I signed the paperwork on that trustee's sale, alone in a courthouse parking lot, with nobody watching and nobody clapping, which I have come to realize is exactly where the realest kind of proof usually happens anyway. If you take one thing away from everything I just told you, let it be this. Being quiet does not mean being weak, and being useful does not mean you have to stay invisible forever while somebody else gets the credit for your steadiness. I spent 10 years being good and steady for people who mistook that for something small, and I'm not angry anymore that it took a recorded deed and a courthouse trustee sale to finally make them look at me differently. I am just glad I stopped waiting for permission to be seen and started building quietly, in the background, the exact kind of proof nobody could argue with when the moment finally came. You raised a toast to my failure that night, in front of everyone who mattered to you, and I raised mine right back to the truth about who was actually holding this family up the whole time. You toasted my defeat, I toasted your ownership, and it turned out to be mine all along. If there is someone in your life who has spent years underestimating exactly how much you carry quietly, I hope this story reminds you that competence does not need an audience to be real, and that the truth, recorded properly, filed correctly, and said out loud at the right moment, has a way of finding daylight eventually, whether anyone was ready for it or not. Thank you for listening to my story all the way to the end. It means more to me than you probably know to have someone actually sit with this instead of scrolling past it. If it moved you even a little, please subscribe. It is completely free. The button is right below this video, and it is the only way these stories keep reaching the people who need to hear them most. Share this with someone who has spent too long being the quiet, reliable one in their own family, the one who fixes everything and gets thanked for none of it. And if you are that person yourself, listening right now from wherever you are, I hope you already know your turn to raise your own glass is coming too.